Wagwan, are you there? What's good? And welcome to the Jerk Jollof and Collard Greens podcast at Jerk Jollof Collard Pod for follows. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm your host G at G Ransom on IG. And for today's panel discussion, I'm joined by an esteemed guest to reveal everything you need to know about the push for reparations to the descendants of Black slaves in America, starting with the state that has truly revitalized and spearheaded this initiative, the state of California. And to do so in proper fashion, we've invited activist, attorney, and chair of California's Reparations Task Force, Ms. Kamilah Moore, to break down the push for reparation, what this $1 million proposal would qualify for, who qualifies to receive the reparation, and what this means for the rest of America. So even if you don't live in the state of California, you got to imagine the impact this particular precedent may have for other states that are also making the push for reparations for Black slave descendants. Now, a little bit about our guest. Ms. Moore earned her Juris Doctor degree from the Columbia Law School in New York City, has a Master's of Law degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a Bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA. Ms. Kamilah Moore was appointed to the Reparations Task Force by the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon. And apart from her academic achievements, Ms. Moore has contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, included but not limited to racial inequality in Brazil and the human right to sanitation in Lowndes County, Alabama. Am I saying that right? All right.
Yes, ma'am.
Awesome. And also the human right remedy for indigenous Black women affected by racialized gender violence in Papua New Guinea. And I must say, you are the epitome of excellence, if I had to say so myself. And, I just threw on my glasses today just so I could at least look smart, in the room with you. So,
well, thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. And definitely you can follow her at Kamilah V. Moore on IG and Twitter. But be sure to check out her website direct at www.kamilahmoore.com to learn more about her achievements, what she's been up to, and as we unveil this topic. So without further ado, we have a saying, let's chop. That means basically let's go ahead and get into the discussion. But first and foremost, how are you? How are you doing today? How's everything in California? And if you want, feel free to tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you're from, where you hail from in the diaspora. You're maybe of Jamaican, African, American descent, and, tell us a little bit more about you.
Sure. Yes. Again, thanks for having me. My name is Kamilah Moore. I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, California, Leimert Park area. I am African-American, so I'm descendants of enslaved Africans who were forced to labor in the United States. My dad was born in Texas. My mom was born in LA. I think both of their families are, from the deep South, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi. What else should I share?
Awesome. So you've got a little bit of everything then.
Yeah, and at UCLA, I was the chairperson of the African Student Union. So I've done a lot of work on, issues that affect, all Black people globally and domestically.
Yes, you certainly have the pedigree. And I understand apart from that, you also have a lot of international studies involved. You went ahead into Amsterdam and studied there. You did a paper on you had the pretty much experience with the human rights with the Papua New Guinea, racialized gender violence. Can you tell us a little bit what that was like? And how do you think that prepared you for tackling particularly reparations in America?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I just grew up in an environment. Leimert Park is a majority Black neighborhood. If you go to Leimert Park on Sundays, you're going to see Black people of all different backgrounds, celebrating each other. My mom just, taught me early on about 40 acres and a mule. So as a kid, I was reading slave narratives from a very young age. You can't really say a lot of young children were doing that. So I kind of always, since a young age, kind of had an affinity for, African-American history and Black history, which I think followed to, my activities at UCLA, being the chair of the African Student Union. And then, I went to law school with an express intent or intention in trying to use a legal degree as the tool to achieve, reparatory justice. So while at Columbia, I took courses related to civil and human rights. I studied abroad at the University of Amsterdam, which enabled me to get a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law. And while there, that's where I wrote, a thesis on, global reparatory justice for people of African descent for the transatlantic slave trade, slavery, and their legacies. So, I mean, the paper had to be like over 50 pages long. So I focused, not only just on the plight of Black Americans, but specifically Black Brazilians and Black Colombians and other folks within the diaspora, like Black Caribbeans as well.
Wow.
And I just leveraged that experience to apply to the state task force.
That is amazing. And definitely say no one has to question your qualifications there. That is absolutely amazing. And I can say you were born to do this, if it's fair to say.
Thank you. And then I guess the other part, Papua New Guinea, I think you asked me about that. But yeah. At Columbia Law, I was a student in this human rights clinic, and one of the projects was to help, Black women in Papua New Guinea, mainly men and women in Papua New Guinea, achieve reparatory justice from gold mining corporations that essentially took over, indigenous land to create a gold mine that has had some really devastating effects on the environment and the economy in the area. So
absolutely,
that was my role as well. Mm-hmm.
Wow, that is amazing. So to know that your skills essentially or your experiences really transpires even just what's happening domestically, but even internationally, kind of gives you insight into, issues impacting not even, people of color from non-people of color, but also, people of color with each other as well.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So that definitely gives you like a non-biased point of view in this regard.
Yes.
That's good to know. All right, so let's break it down. Let's talk about the reparations package. I believe that is considered Bill AB 3121, particularly. And that started, I believe, in 2020, or well, at least assembling the task force. But can you tell us a little bit as far as how did the task force get started and how were its panel members selected?
Sure. So the California Reparations Task Force started because a bill was passed in the California state legislature and then signed by Governor Gavin Newsom called AB 3121. So that legislative statute was introduced by Shirley Weber, who was in the state assembly. She's now California's first Black Secretary of State. But while she was in the assembly, she introduced this legislation, AB 3121. I believe one of her interns, Maureen Simmons, brought to Shirley Weber the idea to do a state task force on reparations. And so they worked together to essentially, author the bill, and it passed both the state assembly, the state senate, and Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, signed the bill into law September 30th, 2020. From there, anyone in the state of California could apply to be on the task force. So it was open to the public. The governor of the state of California had 5 selections. The Speaker of the State Assembly had 2 selections, and the Speaker of the State Senate had 2 selections. So from September 30th, 2020 to around May 2021, you had these appointing officials interviewing potential candidates and selecting candidates. So all 9 members of the task force were appointed by those 3 appointing officials by our first hearing, which was June of 2021. And I was selected by the Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon.
Congratulations. And I guess, can you share like what that process was like? Because, hearing that it's also open to the public, I could imagine, once you hear the word reparations, and was there like a lot of, I guess, did you have to call the herd a bit, or were you aware of like what that process was like, or was it intense, or, what made you qualify? I know we clearly know your qualifications, but, what was it like exactly being selected or going through that process?
Yeah, so the statute that created the task force said, generally speaking, members of the commission should, be knowledgeable about reparations, should, have history with, social justice advocacy and things like that, or, must have some type of academic background in the area. So for me personally, knowing it was open to the public and I applied to all three appointing officials just to increase my chances of getting in, not really knowing what to expect. It was my first time applying to be on a state boarding commission and learning about that process. All states have boards and commissions. A lot of Black folks don't really know much about it, but in state boards and commission, that's where a lot of policy change and influence can arise. So yeah, learning through that process. But again, I just applied to all three. I think if my memory serves me right, I believe I got interviews from all three, but Speaker of the State Assembly, Anthony Rendon's office selected me first. So I just, I accepted it gladly.
Of course. All right, that's awesome. So can we talk about the overall mission? Now, as far as I understand, AB 3121 essentially was to help with, I guess, the scholarly pursuit of reparations, or essentially being kind of like the research intensive group that would first research it and perhaps, I guess, come up with a proposal as far as what they felt was viable. So can you break down the overall mission of the task force and what the day-to-day is like?
Sure. So the mission of the task force was to study, but not only study, but to also develop reparations proposals for African Americans, with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. That's the full formal title of the task force. But in a nutshell, over the course of 2 years, the first year we were in the study phase. So we were inviting hundreds of witnesses to provide personal and expert testimony on, the various different atrocities against the African American community since this nation's founding, since California's statehood, from enslavement to, the badges and incidents of slavery, what we defined like racial terror, political disenfranchisement, racism in the environment and infrastructure, the wealth gap, unjust legal system, separate unequal education, on and on and on. That first year, we were studying, essentially, for lack of better words, those atrocities by enlisting experts outside of our commission to speak more on those topics. And then our final year of our work from mid 2022 to present, the task force ended July 1, 2023 officially. But that final year, we were not really inviting other folks to come and give testimony. That final year was really like the 9-member task force, discussing amongst ourselves, debating amongst ourselves, determining amongst ourselves, what would be those final reparation proposals based on what we studied over the course of a year and a half.
Understood. So when you speak of particularly the atrocities committed against Blacks, I mean, that's not only covering essentially slavery, but also particularly maybe things like redlining or other things that were put in place to essentially keep a certain set of group of people from essentially progressing or getting a fair chance, essentially.
Absolutely. And we thought that was important to do in California because, the idea that, California wasn't a traditional slave state, we debunked that in a sense. We did say there were at least 2,000 Black people enslaved in California. California did have a fugitive slave law that was actually much more aggressive than the federal fugitive slave law. So California was not a sanctuary state, for instance, for runaway slaves. If you so happened to run away to California under that fugitive slave law, you could be deported and re-enslaved in the South, or in some instances, re-enslaved on California soil. And our report actually has the anecdotes of actually enslaved Black people in California, talking about the torture and the sheer abuse that they endured by the hands of their enslavers in California. But I say all that to say, why did I say that? Why did I go on that tangent? We thought it was important not only just to to talk about slavery and describe California's unique history and role in it, but also talk about, to your point, those contemporary areas of systemic discrimination, what we define as those lingering badges and incidents of slavery that has still not been eradicated by, local, state, and even the federal governments.
Wow. So that is a mouthful right there. So it's essentially first having to prove that slavery actually existed in this state. Mm-hmm. And then if not, you mentioned other contemporary acts of disenfranchisement. Right. So, I mean, we're talking about things that have happened, at least for slavery, 400 years or so, more or less, several centuries ago. How do you then conjure up like testimonies from people from things that have happened to ancestors from like centuries ago? Like, how do you start that? Like, was there any way to, I guess, to detect the lineage, or like, how did that start?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, from the academic standpoint, we invited just expert witnesses like Professor Stacy Smith from Oregon State University. She's a white woman, but she dedicated her entire academic career in, investigating California's role in enslavement. But from a personal standpoint, we actually did invite, the descendants of folks that we could find, descendants of slaves who were actually forced to labor in California. So we invited like personal witnesses like Don Bassiano, who her ancestors were enslaved in California, Elmer Fonza, Jonathan Burgess. These are just a few names of people representing families of African Americans who were forced to labor in the state of California. Also, some of these families had land after they found their freedom in California that was unjustly taken. So, we did our due diligence to, not only uncover California's role in slavery, but again, those lingering badges and incidents of slavery that are innumerable almost.
So as a result of the research, I believe a number was dropped as far as potentially what some descendants could end up getting as a result of reparations. And that was probably the most tossed around. It's like, that was it. It was like people saw that and they were like, what is this? You know what I mean? But the number was that's approximately about $1.2 million per descendant, roughly, based on what the research said, correct?
Well, I'm glad you raised that question, because there was a lot of misinformation going on, perpetuated by conservative media. Just kind of it's a long story as to how or why that wasn't able to be tempered down in terms of the messaging. But you're right in the sense that, you correctly cited the amounts floating around, like 1.2 million per resident, the $800 billion in total. But to clarify, what that $1.2 million represents, we hired 5 economists and social scientists, public policy experts, to help us calculate the pure monetary losses of the Black community in California since statehood over the course of 5 different atrocity areas. And so what the economists and public policy experts we hired concluded is, the average 71-year-old African-American Californian has actually lost over his or her lifetime $1.2 million in the areas of unjust property takings or housing segregation, mass incarceration over policing, devaluation of Black businesses, and health harms. Through those various different calculations of estimating the monetary loss across those 5 areas, the total was, okay, well, we could say the average African-American California, due to exclusionary public policy in those particular areas, have lost that much amount of money over the course of their lifetime. In totality, that would represent, due to exclusionary public policy, due to the actions of the state in and of itself, Black folks in California have lost over $800 billion in wealth building opportunities and earning potential since California's statehood. And so now it's up to the state legislature to, study that methodology and along with their constituents, particularly their Black constituents, work together to prescribe an actual amount. It could be more than the estimated loss. It could be less. It could be the same. But we want it to be true to studying what the actual loss is without politics coming into play. And so I'll just briefly say, one of my task force members who's of Japanese descent, Don Tamaki, he's gone on to say in the media, for folks who are shocked at the sticker price, right, of, $800 billion, the state has to pay that. Well, we're not saying the state has to pay that outright right now, but we are saying that is the amount of loss that Black people have endured due to state public policy since statehood. Look, it is what it is. People have to reckon with that first and foremost.
Understood. So, let's say that gets passed, correct? This amount is specific to the state of California. We're not saying, or it cannot be understood that, okay, another state now wants to incorporate reparations. This is the amount for maybe the state of New Jersey or New York. This is just particular to California and kind of also based on, I guess, current day metrics, right? Like the cost of living and property values and, I guess what was lost then versus, now today as an approximate amount. This is really, I guess you could say, more or less idiosyncratic to the state of California.
Yes, absolutely. And just to briefly illustrate why that's correct, for housing segregation, how did the economists and public policy experts come up with an estimated amount of loss in that area? They looked at the time frame in which the state allowed or facilitated redlining with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was an organization facilitated by the state that actively discriminated against Black folks in the areas of redlining. When we talk about restrictive covenants, around 1933 is when HOLC became relevant to the state of California. And then, looking at that particular start date with the end date of formalized or state-sponsored redlining in the state of California with the implementation of the Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. So the economists and the public policy experts came up with the estimated amount of loss based on the lack, the loss of home ownership value between 1933 and 1977, because, the state didn't allow Black folks to outright live where they wanted to live, buy homes where they wanted to live. The areas where we were restricted from buying, now these properties are, millions of dollars, but for redlining and state-sponsored redlining, who's to say the amount of wealth that Blacks lost because of that type of exclusionary public policy. That's just one example.
Understood. So I guess something that comes to mind for me with this is just what would the likelihood be of it being an actual cash settlement versus maybe something that is delivered to eligible the eligible recipients, as maybe looking at Detroit as an example. There were Blacks that were given down payments, for instance, funds to help with down payments or home repairs or things like that, particularly looking at, property values and home values, down payment assistance. I guess there's an idea that, okay, if this passes, I could potentially get $1.2 million check from the state, where it may not necessarily come in that form. I guess what's the likelihood of it coming as a monetary gift, or not a gift, but something that you were owed, but I guess in the form of a monetary stipend, or maybe something in the form of some type of state level assistance, or maybe some type of credit or something like that. I guess what's the likelihood? Did any of the research come back with that regarding how it would be issued?
Well, two notes, under international law, which the state task force was mandated to follow via the statute that created the task force, under international law, you can't call a reparations program a full and effective reparations program unless it includes direct compensation But the other 4 forms of reparations under international law, like rehabilitation, restitution, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. So that's one of the reasons why we recommended cash payments, because under international law, we were required to do so. But then also that ties into the debt that's owed. However, to your point, though, there are task force members, namely State Senator Stephen Bradford, since the task force is over, has gone out into the media and he only has a year left into the Senate, so he's getting termed out soon because of term limits. But he went on NPR, I think literally 2 days ago, and said he's not, as an elected official, very confident that cash payments will become a reality. And so he's actually going to be pushing other recommendations, that's also in our report, like, for instance, providing property tax relief to African Americans, especially descendants living in formerly redlined neighborhoods who purchase or construct a new home, providing direct financial assistance to increase home ownership through shared appreciation loans and subsidized payments, mortgages, and homeowners insurance. Personally speaking, I will be working with folks to make sure all 5 forms of reparations under international law are implemented. But I understand, I think, the trepidation that Senator Stephen Bradford is expressing in terms of he's not sure how politically feasible cash payments may be. And so he is instead going to be pushing for reparations, kind of that looks like a GI Bill, not necessarily direct cash benefits, but other benefits.
So I guess since the task force is over, we could probably speak a little bit more candidly. But it's like, I look at it as, if let's say I work somewhere, I'm working my 9 to 5, right? And my job says, hey, you know what, Glenn, G, we'll take a deduction. Instead of paying you, hourly or paying you a salary, we'll, probably take something off your property taxes, or we'll provide some other form of remediation, but not give you direct compensation. Like, I guess, how appealing does that really end up, or does that really sound? So I guess your everyday person, where you're like, maybe if it's not direct compensation or monetary, that class or the eligible the eligible participants seems to get a little smaller and smaller, because we're talking about years of people not being able to own property or not having access to certain things. So if restitution comes in one of those other forms or those alternatives, that actual rewarded class doesn't really amount to much, it sounds like.
Yeah, and I shared that was my critique of the Evanston, Illinois reparations model. Is initially their reparations looked like giving $25,000 grants only for the purposes of paying down the mortgage or fixing housing repairs. There was no direct cash option. And so one of my critiques is, well, that you're not really fully repairing anyone. You're not really fully repairing the class, because you're limiting the class to folks who own homes. You know what I mean? And people who've been affected by redlining, they're not always going to actually have a home. That was the whole point. Like, with redlining, we were relegated to the projects and apartments. And so a lot of folks who've been impacted by redlining actually don't have homes to own. And the African American or Black people who do, they are an exception to the rule. So you're really just like giving reparations to the exception, but not the masses. So that to me was counterintuitive. But now recently, Evanston is paying out cash payments. Those, instead of just 25,000 grants for mortgages or for home repairs, they're actually giving direct cash to the community of who should be eligible. Because I think under international law, there's something called satisfaction, right? The harmed group is supposed to lead and dictate their repair. So not necessarily a board, a commission, a city council, right? And so over time, the Evanston board, was hearing some really pure dissatisfaction from the community of eligibility around the program. And so now you see, as recent as this past month, they're actually opening it up and giving actual direct cash payments. And so just to briefly conclude in the California context, I do respect my fellow task force member, Senator Stephen Bradford, and I understand his viewpoint, and I respect it, especially since he's an elected official. He knows probably more than anyone, like the climate of his colleagues in the legislature. But at the same time, hearing from the community of eligibility in California, cash payments is a number one, recommendation and proposal that people are looking to actually come to fruition. So, that's one of the reasons why, even still, like despite the climate of the legislature, I'm still going to use my bully pulpit as a chair to continue to recommend that.
Yeah, kudos, definitely, because it's like, here's a down payment, help, a subsidy for the home that you don't own. You know what I mean? Or you can't afford. Congrats. Here's your reparations. Congrats. This is like, can I get that 40 acres instead? Because I don't know what to do with this, but we're also talking about the state of California, talking about extremely high cost of living. Like, just throwing a home at someone isn't necessarily going to help when they probably like, hey, I don't have food to eat, or I'm having trouble, on my day-to-day, let alone, okay, here's a subsidy to help you with a down payment over your property taxes. And like you said, they are owning the homes. There's a good chance you're really giving funds to, not necessarily, but you're probably giving funds to people that may not be in the dire need of it. So that's interesting. So I guess another question here, you mentioned the emphasis of international law when it came towards the research. So I imagine, looking at the restitutions that were paid to Holocaust members or Holocaust survivors was probably one of the main things, right, with the research that helped with the task force?
Yes. So the task force, we issued 2 reports. We issued an interim report last June, so June 2022, that really just described the history of the nation's role in slavery, and California's role in slavery, and describe those 12 major areas of systemic discrimination, or those lingering badges and incidents of slavery. But in this final report that we just released, June of 2023, we reproduced the interim report. So the first 13 chapters are essentially the interim report that we released last year. But the remaining chapters in the final report obviously include our final recommendations. But one of the chapters also is a chapter discussing different models of reparations, not only in the United States, but globally as well. So, there is in this final report, we talk about reparations, the limited reparations that occurred post-apartheid in South Africa. We talked about reparations in Chile. And then, of course, as you noted, reparations in the Germany-Israel context post the Holocaust as well.
And then how significant do you think those particular, I guess you could call them precedents, I guess how much weight did that have as far as the discussion? Because, I mean, amongst like scholars and, people that are for the mobilization, these are things that have been known or been talked about for quite some time. Like, I guess, in other words, what was the push for, Black people, Black slave descendants now? Was there a particular opening that occurred within the past couple of years for like the 3-year span of the task force? Or, what exactly was that, I guess, voila moment that was like, hey, this is now the time to do it?
It's a good question. I mean, in the reparation space, that's like a whole area of contention where, I'm going to keep it real. Some people will credit, the California Reparations Task Force coming into fruition due to, the grassroots activists who have been, advocating for, set-asides for descendants of American slaves. That's like one, I guess, point where people are saying, okay, this is why this became a reality. But then also, in 2020, the summer of 2020, you had this reckoning, after the unjust murder of George Floyd, where, for a very limited amount of time, albeit, you had at least these corporations, these institutions, politicians, important individuals, influential individuals, at least, starting to admit, the history of racism, casteism bias in this country. And so, I also want to credit that moment that we were in. It was very, how do you say it? It went by really quickly, but I do credit that moment. I think Governor Gavin Newsom, he actually signed the bill that created the task force on the very last day, like September 30th, 2020. And then I heard that, Ice Cube, had called Newsom, sign this.
Yeah.
Grassroots organizers got in contact with Ice Cube and say, hey, can you push this? So I don't know. I feel like it was a confluence of factors, but I would say definitely I would credit, grassroots activists, and then also just the moment we were in 2020 that seemed like people were ready to have a serious conversation about what comes after or next after Black Lives Matter reparations.
Understood. Now, I guess coming back to the actual proposal, how was eligibility determined per se? What was there anything that broke down the process to determine whether or not you were eligible? Because I know most people just assume that all Blacks were slave descendants, and that may or may not be the case. Or there was also something I saw in the headlines was that some white people were actually eligible to receive reparations. So, how was eligibility determined in that sense, or did anything cover that?
So yeah, the task force, we discussed off and on the idea of who should be eligible for the first 10 months of the task force. We had two major meetings where we discussed it in detail, and that was February and March 2022. So the February meeting, we were supposed to decide finally who's going to be eligible. And then that vote got postponed. It was very contentious. It got postponed to the next meeting, which was March 2022. And in that meeting, via a 5-4 decision, slim majority, the majority of task force members voted to define the community of eligibility as those who are descendants of free or an enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900. So at the time we were saying, okay, that's not a race-based standard because that would exclude obviously Black folks who, are not descendants of folks who were either free or enslaved and living in the United States prior to 1900. But it's a lineage-based standard. Do you come from that particular lineage or ancestry? The author of the bill, Shirley Weber, she was not on the task force, but she's the person who is the reason why the task force was a thing, because she authored the bill creating it. We invited her to provide expert testimony in the February hearing because we just weren't sure, what do we do? Because I guess to summarize both sides of the argument, so to speak, if you want to call it both sides, the task force members who were advocating for a race-based standard were essentially making the argument, all Black people, regardless of lineage or national origin, deal with anti-Blackness, deal with systemic discrimination, and therefore all Black people should be included in our proposals for reparations. But then you had, the other side. I hate using sides because it shouldn't be like that. But the folks who were advocating for a lineage-based standard were essentially saying, reparations, it's a debt that's owed to a particular class of people. It was owed to their ancestors. And so logically, it should just go to the direct descendants of those people. And Shirley Weber, in her expert testimony, essentially defined who she had in mind when she thought about who should be eligible. And she was an advocate for lineage-based reparation. She said, it should be for descendants of, free Blacks and enslaved Blacks to, I guess you could say, acknowledge the unique history of African Americans in this country. We obviously have a history of enslavement in this country, but there are also people who, Black people who were freed before the majority of us in this country, but still had to navigate a very precarious society, could be threatened with enslavement and all this other stuff. So after that, and notably, I'll just conclude by saying this. There's one Jamaican American on our task force, Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, who is the chair of geography studies at UC Berkeley. He's written a book called Scammer's Yard about reparations in Jamaica,
Mm-hmm.
particularly around how articulating how I guess Black scammers in Jamaica scamming white rich people. That is a form of reparations in and of itself. The way he had described it was very, very articulate and very thought provoking. But he's actually the one, Dr. Lewis, who introduced a motion to make the community of eligibility based on lineage rather than race, with the keen understanding that motion, if passed, would exclude him as a Jamaican American. So
Absolutely.
Interesting times.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess how would lineage be proven? Is that just like, are we doing blood tests? Like what exactly is happening? I guess, is there any way that was that covered in the research?
Well, it wasn't necessarily covered in the research, but in deciding, whether we were going to do a race-based or lineage-based standard, we did invite 6 genealogists to give expert testimony on the general feasibility of a lineage-based standard. What are some things that would need to be proven or shown to demonstrate you have that lineage? And we took a poll, and I think 5 of the 6 genealogists were, at the end of the day, advocated for lineage versus a race-based standard, and then laid out ways in which that can be achieved. But the idea that the task force came up with in our final report is we're recommending a new state agency, tentatively called the California American Freedmen Affairs Agency, that pays homage to the Freedmen's Bureau that once existed, short-lived, existent in this country. But this new state agency would include an eligibility, a genealogy office, would hire, board certified genealogists to assist with any eligibility claims, because the idea is that burden of proof, so to speak, shouldn't rest on the individual. It should rest on the state in recognition of the harm done. But I would say, honestly, technology has become so advanced. If we were having this conversation maybe 30, 40 years ago, the idea of like, how do you prove your lineage or ancestry, I think would be a little bit harder conversation to have. But in 2023, the technological advancements are just immense. As we speak, you have the Smithsonian, they're transcribing Freedmen's Bureau records. Wow. You have 23andMe or Ancestry.com. You do that test, it'll tell you, your ancestors came from the early African-American communities from Virginia. So, just to conclude, the rules for eligibility aren't necessarily set in stone. That probably won't happen until actual legislation in the next 6 to 8 months or a year or so. But there's a lot of different ideas out there, and it's very achievable. Native Americans have something similar as well. I'm not necessarily advocating for blood quantum, stuff like that, but there are ways to make it happen. Yeah.
Understood. So I know one thing in particular, and this is even something that's hotly debated amongst, people of color as well. When you mention reparations, it's just, it's kind of funny. Like, I know Germany issued restitutions to the Holocaust survivors, but particularly the word reparations is somehow kind of used interchangeably with handout. And it's like the understanding that this is not a handout. We're talking, at least from my point of view, we're talking about money owed for labor unpaid, particularly a labor that has fueled most of America's economy to where it is today, particularly even the South, as we can see the effects of, post-slavery, how a lot of the Southern states that benefited from it are kind of in shambles. So I guess, how do we navigate the discussion, handout versus debt owed, and, particularly helping people understand why reparations are important or even necessary?
That's a really great question. And it's something the task force has grappled with. But essentially, we have concluded that how do you respond to that question or that framing? Like you said, reparations is not a handout, particularly when we're talking about our cash payments methodology. One of my fellow task force members, Dr. Jovan Scott Lewis, he's going out in the media and said, we're not advocating the state give money to anyone. We're advocating for the state to return money stolen, to return monies dispossessed due to the state's own actions, due to the state deciding to implement public policy that excluded opportunities for this particular group of people to build wealth in various different areas, from businesses, real estate. We can go on and on and on. So again, particularly when we talk about reparations in general, but obviously in the form of cash payments, it's not a handout, it's a debt owed, particularly in California's context. We're advocating for the state to return money stolen, not to give money to African Americans. But then on the other side of it, white people have received handouts in this country since this country's inception. Even white people who immigrated to the United States after slavery was over. And we note this in our report. We talk about the California Homestead Act and the Federal Homestead Act. And the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. noted this too in one of his last speeches, right? While Congress refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, was giving away millions and millions of acres of land almost for free to its white peasant class from Europe, which meant it was willing to undergird this newly arriving European peasant class with an economic floor, while depriving that same opportunity to Black Americans who've been here even since before America became a country, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And so what are the present day implications of that example of exclusionary public policy? Well, nearly 25% of the white adult population living today are present day beneficiaries of that land transfer, of that handout by the California federal government that by and large Black Americans were excluded from. And there are so many instances of public policy we can look to. For instance, Black women, we have been saddled with the idea of us being welfare queens, right? Well, we can look at, this is all in the report, something called the Mother's Pension Bill or Fund of the 1930s. Most of that money to go to poor mothers, over 90% went to white mothers. Wow. Black women did not get that. So who are the real welfare queens? Like, when we can look at public policy and show how, again, white Americans have received handouts time and time again. And, so what we're dealing with, Black Americans have always dealt with in this country is just a nonstop gaslighting campaign.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because let's be real, slavery was probably the biggest reparation to non-Blacks.
Yeah, that was a handout.
Well, that was a definite handout. Talk about free labor. Oh, yeah. Forget about it. So I know, infamously, we talk about the struggle of Black Americans or Blacks in America as it relates to economics and finances. I know amongst my circles, particularly one thing that's always referenced is the renowned Dave Chappelle skit where they issued reparations and everybody was spending it on, luxury cars. And, it was, of course, meant to be comedic, but, a little distasteful in a sense, but meant to be comedic. Particularly, using comedy as a vessel to highlight certain things. But let's get to the real part of that, because that is a legit concern. Let's say, was there anything in particular with the task force research that covered, I guess, utilization of funds? I know, particularly, we talked about earlier, how some states are doing, subsidies or down payment assistance or some form of not particularly a cash compensation, direct compensation, but some form of assistance and other means. Was there anything covering in the event that cash would be compensated? Was there any protections against how funds would be used or any misappropriation? Or at the end of the day, was it like, what? Your ancestors worked for this, you can spend it however you want. Was there anything in particular that was argued for that?
Yeah, I think we had conversations around that. And, there's 9 different members on the task force. So we all had our own kind of opinions and ideas around that, where you had some task force members saying whatever we come up with, financial literacy should be some component of it. You had other task force members saying, actually studies show that Black folks, we are actually very responsible with our money. Most of our money goes to needs like rent and food and bills. And so it's actually a misnomer that we spend frivolously. And so We shouldn't put in any rules or stipulations to the funding. But I think what we landed on is, again, we recommended a new state agency for Black Americans who descend from slaves in America. One of those offices I said would be an eligibility or genealogy office, but there would be other reparatory justice branches that would be responsible for, providing ongoing direct reparatory justice services, but also providing oversight on existing agencies and things like that. So one of the offices would be like a business affairs office. And I think, we said in the report that business affairs office would provide optional, like financial literacy classes and things like that. And, providing opportunities for business grants and things like that. But I don't think it's something that we put as a mandatory requirement or anything like that.
Understood. And I think it's like the interesting part, like hearing you speak about it more, is just basically it's not just a simple, here's your money, go away. It's really establishing different agencies, different institutions. And this is all also included in that amount, correct? Like the money to fund these particular agencies to help with the facilitation of the reparations, right?
Yeah, well, now that's a good question. I have to reread the methodology because I don't think we put in that $800 billion, I think that $800 billion just represents the total amount of loss the Black community has incurred over time. I don't think that includes the estimated cost to create a state agency, but I have to double check. But to your point, yes, it's not just about, here's money, here's some proposals that we can attach to existing state agencies. We're actually recommending the creation of new institutions, like a new state agency, like a bank, for, specifically for Black Americans. We're recommending like actual institutions, because the idea is there needs to be new institutions for work of this magnitude.
Understood. Now, could you share like what were some of the biggest challenges you think, like with your experience, what was the challenge particularly for the state of California, and what do you think the challenge will be for other states that are considering the same thing or considering applying reparations?
Well, I think one of the challenges that this California Reparations Task Force specifically that we dealt with, and I've been pretty candid, I think that we didn't really do a great job in terms of marketing and communications, and there's a whole back story as to why that was the case. But what I've recommended to states, localities that want to do something similar, want to create similar commissions, do everything via a public bids process. Don't allow task force members to, rest on their past connections and say, oh, look, my friend does communication, so let them do the communication for the task force. Don't do that. Like, do everything above board public bid process to make sure you're getting the best quality, the most competent, so that you can actually get the word out, because reparations is too sacred of a topic, too sacred of a subject to play around with. So, I mean, just personally speaking, that's one of the challenges that we dealt with, was that. But, I think there is opportunity and promise for states to model what they might do after the task force in terms of, hiring consultants like the economists and public policy experts to do a state-specific analysis of the losses of the Black community in their particular state, and using that as a basis for coming up with what reparations might be in the form of cash payments for Black folks in their particular states, is something that, I'm proud of the task force actually doing.
Yeah, and that's definitely amazing work.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what my mind starts to tinker is just, do you think the overall, because like once more going back to reparations in particular for, people of color in this country, just not getting a good rap, do you think it's because that debt essentially would be too great for America to pay back in a way? Like there's really no way to pay back that debt that particularly it's not as simple as, or it's not typically well received, or it's been heavily politicized, or like pretty much like a smear. Like for us to ask for reparations, it's just kind of like, well, gather yourself by your bootstraps, like most Americans did, but that really isn't the case now that you really look at the history. Like, you feel like this debt is too great to actually be paid back, or is reparations a start?
I think it's a start, but I think that you're right in diagnosing like people's gut reaction when they hear about reparations is like, we were enslaved, I don't know, like 200 and something years ago, but we've actually, like Ta-Nehisi Coates have said, African Americans, we've been enslaved in this country longer than we've actually been free. So there's actually a lot more work to do. But to your point, like Dr. Sandy Darity, who wrote the book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in 21st Century. He's an economist at Duke University. He was one of the economic consultants the California Reparations Task Force enlisted. And he estimated that the federal government owes at least $14 trillion in reparations. And that's just federally. In California, we said the loss is $800 billion.
Wow.
Federal level, he's saying, this United States owes African Americans $14 trillion, which I think averages, when you think about like 44 million Black Americans, that's like $300,000 per person or something like that. So individually, if it's like $300,000, like that's a lot, but it's not even a lot when you think about it. But you know what I mean? But when you hear 14 trillion, like that does seem like too much, like a lot. But the debt's the debt,
Exactly. I'm pretty sure like Navient isn't looking at my debt like, oh yeah, you know what, gee, that's a lot. Let me help you out. Like, no, it's like, it's owed. You went to school, you got to pay it back.
Hey, wow. Looking at me like,
exactly.
You ain't getting no handouts.
Hey, we're really better hoping in reparations. But give me a Sally Mae reparation, I'll take it. So I guess when we look at the numbers, how particularly did anything cover how exactly it would be funded? Like, I'm not under the impression that any state is sitting on this large sum of money to ready and at any point to give out. Like, how exactly would the reparations be funded?
Well, that was another topic that the task force, we turned a stone over, but we actually concluded by saying, and we looked over the statute that created our task force. We consulted with the California DOJ Civil Rights Enforcement Section team that by law was providing us legal, administrative, and technical assistance. And we concluded together that, upon a close reading of our statute, we actually weren't necessarily required to determine how our proposals would be funded. We did have conversations about that just to do our due diligence. So, we invited tax professionals who talked about different tax schemes, like putting an inheritance tax on, and because that's a whole other story around like rich Californians and they barely get taxed and stuff like that. So, or creating new like they called it like a 501c40, where it's like, benefactors, rich benefactors voluntarily putting money into this fund that would go to support. You had, for instance, State Senator Stephen Bradford, who's on the task force. He recommended, well, how about setting aside 0.2% of the state's annual budget to funding our final proposal. So there's various different ideas floating around and ideas that we explored, but there's no like official recommendation from the task force as to how to fund our proposals. I think we concluded that that's something that the legislators, that's a political conversation that the legislators need to have, but we did discuss it, I think, at least.
I know definitely one of those kind of lines that were pretty much thrown around out there was just that basically, yeah, we're just going to get the rich white people to pay for it, or all white people will essentially contribute towards this debt. And it's just like, it doesn't necessarily, is not particularly work that way. Like, I mean, we're talking about the wealthy, the elites, they know loopholes to avoid paying their taxes, even on a national level, let alone paying a reparations tax. But I guess the concern that all white people would have to pay this debt, essentially, whether or not they were the benefactors of, slavery or chattel bound slavery isn't necessarily, the case, or it was an option, but not necessarily the case.
Yeah, no, definitely not the case. I mean, there's 2 points I want to bring up. With the Evanston, Illinois thing, their reparations was funded by marijuana tax. So in that instance, if you were a Black person and you supported dispensaries in Evanston, Illinois, you could potentially be paying for your own reparations. Like, I mean, and just generally speaking, if reparations on federal level, state, local, comes from taxes, everyone pays taxes. So it's not just white people who pay taxes. So you might even have, if it is supported by taxes, Black people paying for their own reparatory justice. I mean, I think that's personally a shame, but it is what it is. But the second point I want to raise is, white conservatives, or just conservatives in general, not just white people, conservatives, people who are anti-reparations bring up this point all the time. Like, why should I, pay reparations? I was not a slave owner. My people were not here during slavery, all this other stuff. But I'm like, no one says if you immigrate to Germany right now, you could not say, I am not paying my taxes because I was not here in Germany and my parents and their parents were not here in Germany during the Holocaust. So why should my tax dollars be given to pay, victims and heirs of the Holocaust? Like, no one makes that argument because that would be silly to make, right? If you immigrate to a country, you take part of its benefits, but also its debts. And it just shows, like, I think the pervasive kind of hate that people have for descendants of slaves in America, because they only use that argument against us. Like, they would hesitate to make that same argument if they were to immigrate to Germany, for instance.
Exactly. And I think you definitely hit it on the head there, and definitely a great point. Let me see, Ms. Moore, you covered a lot, and, I feel like we just really hit the tip of the conversation, but with the time allowed and all the information gathered, I would say this has been a very insightful discussion. And look at that, like an hour has gone by super fast. But thank you again. I mean, thank you for everything that you've been doing and everything that you've done. I guess, can you share, like, what are some of the next steps? I know the task force is over, but I guess what is happening next, or what can we expect, I guess, in the state of California in the next couple of years or so?
Yeah, so thank you again for having me. In terms of next steps, you're going to see, grassroots organizations working together, led by Black grassroots organizations, but working with all different types of organizations, cross-culturally, cross-politically, to make sure that reparations becomes a reality in the state of California. So within the next 6 to 8 months, the California state legislators, they're on summer recess now, but late fall, early winter, they'll be back into session. That'll be the earliest time later this year that they're able to introduce new legislation. So it's a very exciting time, because within the next 6 to 8 months or so, we will be seeing reparations legislation being introduced to the state legislature based on the California Reparations Task Force in our final report. So within that time frame, you're going to see, base building to make sure there's a critical mass of individuals and organizations that are putting the necessary pressure on the state legislature to actually make sure that these proposals are implemented into law. So folks can go to my personal website. You can subscribe to my email updates. You can go to supportreparations.org. That is a website that one of my fellow task force members created. If you're a part of an organization that wants to officially sign on to endorse the task force in our final report, that's supportreparations.org. You can look up an organization called CJEC, Coalition for a Just and Equitable California. I believe their website is cjec-official.org. They're the premier grassroots organization that is essentially leading the charge to make sure these proposals are actually implemented. They have a mailing list and text updates. So I would just say stay engaged and stay tuned we need all hands on deck for this next period, even though the task force is over. I think the most important stage is coming soon.
Awesome. And thank you again. And also for your direct website, can you go ahead and share that one more time for us?
Sure. My direct website is KamilahMoore.com. On there, I have an education tab. Well, I have PowerPoint presentations loaded on there that gives kind of an overview of the task force and the different chapters in our report. And there's also a contact page where you can stay in contact with me.
Awesome. Sounds great. And I'll be waiting and anticipating, hopefully you make a book that we can catch up on or read. We could talk about the ins and outs, the day-to-day of the task force, and even everything that you're up to as well. I'll be sure to follow and stay abreast of everything that's happening. But Ms. Moore, thank you. Hang on before we adjourn though. But once more, follow us at Jerk Jollof Collard Pod to stay in the know. Also to get tips and the teasers for this episode as well as future ones as well. Be sure to follow us. We'll be sure to post the links that Ms. Moore provided as well on our post for promoting this episode. So you're in the know. You can have all that for reference as well. So be sure to look out for the description on IG when we post this teaser, and the full episode will be releasing in a week. So we hope you all enjoyed this recording. Hopefully there'll be a part 2, maybe once everything gets back up and running again with the grassroots efforts as things develop. Maybe we'll be looking at what's happening in California and look at what's happening for the rest of America as well. But thank you again for joining. Hang on once we end this recording. And any other last words for the people out there?
Well, I guess my only last word is, I think what's next for me, I might be, doing that book, spilling the tea, the behind the scenes,
Absolutely.
But also, notably speaking around my global reparatory justice experience, I'm really interested in having initiating conversations for Black Americans Black people who descend from slaves across the diaspora, from the Caribbean to Colombia, to Brazil. This is stuff that I talked about in my thesis. For the purposes of the California Reparations Task Force, I was very specific in advocating for African Americans who are descendants of slaves who were forced to labor in the United States. But I'm just looking forward to just expanding upon that. And again, having conversations with Black folks in the diaspora. We're all descendants of slaves, from Jamaica to Trinidad to Brazil to Colombia. I think there's language barriers, that have precluded us from kind of connecting in the ways in which that I think we could or should. You got Black Colombians who speak Spanish, you have Haitians who speak French, Black Brazilians who speak Portuguese, you have Jamaicans, African Americans who speak English. But I feel like despite those language barriers, I think there's a lot of potential in connecting descendants of slaves across the diaspora. And I think Malcolm X was at least trying to do that. Mm-hmm. His last organization was the Organization of Afro-American Unity, which included, conversations not only with African Americans in the United States, but across the diaspora. And his goal was, what does it look like when descendants of slaves across the diaspora are able to connect and build power, and then link with the Organization of African Unity, with the African continent, to then again build upon that. So now I'm interested in seeing what that looks like. But, that's a monumentous task. And I've just been resting after this past 2 years, but I do kind of see that on my horizon as well. So absolutely. I say that to say what you all are doing, you're ahead of the game in terms of the name of your podcast and the diversity of the folks who lead your podcast as well. So keep up the great work.
Thank you very much, Kamilah. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. And yeah, definitely, if you need anyone to help with that effort, trust, you can call on us. I'll be definitely down to assist with that, because like you said, joining on the conversation and getting everyone in the room, that's the crucial and very imperative first step. So thank you for the kudos. It means a lot. Thank you. We're doing something. We're doing a good job. Yeah. Well, other than that, we hope y'all stay well, stay blessed, keep it safe out there, keep it smart this summer. We want to see you all back again this fall. And wherever you are, wherever you're listening from, we love y'all. Thank you for tuning in for your daily dose of culture. And thank you, Kamilah, again. And hope to see you next time. Peace.